Dearly Father, we just thank you for bringing us through this week. You know, it's been kind of busy and a lot going on. Thank you for giving us this time to just take a break from it and concentrate on your word a little bit. And kind of excited about tonight as we get to dig into the message that you've got here in Genesis 1 for us. And pray to just bless this time. In your name I pray, amen. All right, so over the past few weeks, what we've been essentially doing is setting the stage for this passage of scripture. And it's not that this is necessarily any important than other scriptures, although it is the first one. So therefore it holds a pretty special place in the big picture. We saw that last week. And so trying to figure out why it's here, why this was the first thing God wanted us to know and the Israelites to know is pretty important. And so that's what we're going to start to dig into. And my guess is that we will probably not finish. This will be the first time we don't actually finish what I had planned for tonight. So we'll try to get to a stopping point and then pick it up again next week. The one thing that we've been alluding to, but have not necessarily mentioned quite yet, is this concept here that the people that we've been talking about, that these Israelites and the cultures and cities and nations around them, what we call the ancient Near Eastern cultures, define an object's existence in terms that we find strange sometimes. Although when you think about it, or if we track it down, which we're going to do here in a second, it does make sense that this is how they would conceptualize the things that are around them, the way they look at their natural world. And so I decided, I didn't know if Molly would be here tonight or not, but decided to go with this example. So we've got this keyboard over here, and I don't know exactly how you pronounce that. Kurzweil. Presumably, there have been some employees at that company that assembled that keyboard, right? So several levels of construction. So they would have had to create the form, wire it up, put all little gizmos and thingamabobs and those kinds of things in place, close it up, and we would essentially say that at this point, the keyboard is physically has been constructed. Okay. Is it ready to be shipped out yet? No, because there's still some things that need to be done to it. Somebody's got to install the software and kind of test it out, do some things. So let's say it gets, all this happens to it, software gets installed, and they now ship it out. Would we say that at that point it is fully created? It's realized its full, complete existence? No, that arrives here at Christ Point, and Jim takes it out of the box. Is it ready to go? No, still got to put some legs on it. And more importantly, we got to do what? Plug it in. Okay. So it's got to have that the electricity to power it. And at that point, it is now functional. But would we still define its existence that way? We don't really define its existence until what happens? It's played. Okay. It realizes its purpose. So until Molly sits down and turns it on and leads us in worship with that instrument, the existence of that keyboard is not realized. So what you've got there is several levels of what we might define as existence, and each one has certain elements to it. One is essentially all material, physical. The other one is all functional. Some have different variations of both. But what ancient Near Eastern folks would have approached the things in their environment would have been in that last context. Okay. Nothing was important unless it was actually fulfilling its purpose. Otherwise, it was just part of the inanimate stuff that goes on around them. Does that make sense? So what they would attempt to do is explain the world in that sense. And the way they go about doing that was at odds with what God is trying to create, okay, or what God is trying to do here. And so as we look at the process of creation here, create the description that we have here, creation, is getting at the function and the purpose of these things, not simply their material existence. Okay. The ancients didn't care about the sun for the sun's sake. All right. They cared about the sun because the sun meant life, right? And light, and these things that the sun does. And so as we read through this, we need to be able to think about it from that context. Think about functions, think about purpose, and think about why God would have done what he did. Okay. As we saw last week, there's a lot of the sort of the physical stuff left out, which tells us that that is not the focus here. There is a lot of detail on things that don't make sense when you focus on the physical. And so as we shift our focus to things that are less structural, less physical, and more in the realm of purpose and function, we will see some things kind of come out that God's trying to communicate, specifically to the Israelites, but then also throughout the centuries to us. Okay. All right. So we haven't done this yet, but I'm going to go ahead and read this passage. All right. And be listening for the functions, be listening for the purpose as it comes out in, especially with the days. All right. And then in day 6, of course, we've got quite a bit of description there. So I'm just going to read 1:1 through, we're going to go all the way through 2:3 as we consider it, the passage in its entirety, and then come back and hit a few things maybe tonight and probably into next week. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters above from the waters below." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He also made the stars. And God said, "Set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness." And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. When God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Okay, so let's take a look at a few things here. And kind of consider this concept of the theme that's running through here is more functional in purpose than physical existence, and why it was important to the Israelites primarily, but then also to us. So one of the first clues we get is so basically we're focusing on functional existence and purposeful. One of the first clues we get is this creation word. So that very first word in verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is a Hebrew term called bara, which is used about 54 times throughout Scripture. It's only used a few times here in chapter 1. Interestingly enough, in chapter 1 here, Moses uses words like God made. Remember, we talked about action words last week. And creation shows up once there in chapter 1. It shows up 3 times in verse 27. So God created man in the image of God. He created him, male and female. He created him. So that's 3 uses of the same word there. Interestingly, the only other thing that we use this word for was the sea creatures, where he created the sea creatures. And that's verse 21. Everything else was let the earth bring forth, and let there be these kinds of things. That's not to say that the act of creation was necessarily any different, but this particular word, and especially in the context of, remember, verse 1 is sort of a overview of the whole process. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then how does it end in chapter 2? It says that God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And so he started with the work. That was the overarching verse. And then we end with that. And everything in the middle would be interesting little points along the way. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this particular word is that all of the other times it's used in the Scripture, the object or the subject of that verb is always God. Okay, that particular word is never attributed to man. All right, so these other words, remember we talked about how you can make things, and that a lot of these other creative activity words that are in here, another good place we would see them show up would be when they were building the tabernacle. When those craftsmen were doing what they were doing, they would use these words. When Solomon's building the temple, we see these words come out. But with bara, we never see it other than an activity that God does. This seems to be one that man never participates in. The other thing that's interesting is that if we look at some of its uses, and I just picked a few here. So this one, of course, we have just gone through. And as we go through this, what I want you to focus on is the object, what was created. So here it's the heavens and the earth. Then in 27, it was created man in the image of God. He created him, male and female. He created them. So it's mankind in all three cases. And I just picked a few of the 50 or so that are out there. In Exodus 34, so at the foot of Mount Sinai, he says, behold, I am making a covenant with you before all of your people. I will do marvels. It's interesting because they just came out of Egypt where all those plagues happened. So he's not referring to those. He's referring to new things he's going to do, such as have not been created in all the earth or in any nation, and all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. The same one. This is one you're probably familiar with. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. That is a bara in that statement. And Isaiah's got a ton of them. And this would be one around the midpoint. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all of these things. And so what's interesting here is that as we think about the uses of this particular word, the subject is always God, and the objects are always things that usually do not have a physical context to them, like marbles or a clean heart or mankind even. And even when there may be something that we can describe in physical terms, oftentimes the context around it suggests that that is not what the author's after. Okay, there's just something bigger and more meaningful about this term, that when God is creating these things, why are we creating the clean heart? Why did we create man in our image? Why are we making this covenant and doing these marvels to show our glory to all of the Canaanites, right? And the Egyptians, all these other cultures? There's a purpose to why he's doing these things. And so the objects of these tell us something important about the way in which Moses uses this word, that he's often trying to put them in the context of why he's doing it, in the context of function and purpose and goals on God's part, not that he's just doing it because physically it needs to be done. Okay. And so as he sets the stage now for this chapter 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What we have to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of the heavens and the earth in God's eyes? What is it he wants to tell them about this particular event? And what is it that they should be learning from it? Interestingly enough, the correlation here is actually borne out in the next sentence. What does it say in verse 2? The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now we're going to focus on this first phrase. The earth was without form and void. So there's a couple of terms here. So the Hebrew terms in this case are tohu and bohu. Tohu is used 20 times in the Old Testament. And the reason why I always say Old Testament on that is because, remember, the New Testament was written in what language? Greek. Okay, so these Hebrew words are not going to show up there. In this case, the without form, which most of our scriptures or most of our English translations will put in without form or formless, something along those lines. If you check your version there, you'll see something similar to that. Not a whole lot of variety there. And bohu is the word that is translated as void in this verse. And based on our English uses of these words, where have we always gone with this? We immediately go to a kind of a physical. There's no form to it. It has no form, and the form has nothing in it. It's void. Okay. The context of these two phrases in Hebrew do not bring that physical sense to them. Okay, as we can see from the uses. All right. So the context of these in other places. All right. So here's the original. The earth was without form and void. So those are the two Hebrew words we'll be tracking: tohu and bohu. Another one where we see it used multiple times is in Deuteronomy. So you remember that the original generation screws up, and God's judgment is what? You guys are going to wander around in the wilderness till y'all are gone, and the next generation will get to go into the promised land that I promised you. Okay. Most of the time when the wilderness is described, and again, it's not the physical nature of the wilderness, it is that isolation. I mean, that wandering, that the wailing and gnashing of teeth that was going on. And this is what Moses is describing to that next generation, that your predecessors, your ancestors were wandering around in this howling waste of a wilderness. Barren is oftentimes a word that's used. And so Moses is making the point that even while they were wandering around in that waste of the wilderness, tohu, he encircled him, he cares for him, and he keeps him as the apple of his eye. God did not give up on his promise to Israel. Jump a little bit to 1 Samuel. Do not turn aside after empty things that can not profit or deliver, for they are empty. Both of these describe tohu. So again, this would be very difficult to put a physical form in place as we conceptualize it. Isaiah again has a lot of this. All the nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted by him less than nothing, and they are worthless. So tohu in this case is translated as worthless. And so that gives you context of what empty means and what wasteland means. That wilderness, where he's got them wandering around the wilderness, that was, I had promised you a land of milk and honey, but now I'm going to send you to this worthless land and let you wander around till y'all are gone and your kids can go. And then this one I think is probably the most interesting, is later in Isaiah. He's talking about just the nature of the culture there in Israel. And if you've ever read most of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea gets into it a lot. Israel was not doing good things. Okay, so this would be right before we get dispersed to Babylon. No one sues righteously and no one pleads honestly. They trust in confusion and speak lies. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity. And so the word tohu there is going to be translated as confusion. This one actually gets translated in a lot of different ways. And so if you have time and look that one up, you might see things like false words, false witness. Basically what they were doing is they're taking each other to court, lying about each other in order to make themselves look better and take advantage of each other. And so their legal system was built around this confusion and lies and mischief and iniquity. And God was done with them. Okay. So as we look at these, this use of this is tohu, the waste, the empty things, the worthless, and confusion. Okay, and it was used 20 times. That 3 times is this guy. Where bohu is used, that's a duplicate slide. Bohu is used 3 times, and it's always in conjunction with this guy. And so I saved this one till now, where you see tohu and bohu together again. But the desert owl and screech owl will possess it. The great owl and raven will nest there. God will stretch out over Edom, the measuring line of chaos and the plumb line of desolation. So this gives us a little bit more insight on what formless and void means. Okay. We can't just go to physical form and think that that's what Moses is trying to convey. What we're trying to convey is ideas like confusion, chaos, desolation, barrenness. So this is what the existence of the world was at the beginning. Okay. That in the beginning, God created heavens, the earth. The earth was without form and void. It was chaotic. It was it was confused. It had no purpose. It had none of these things in place. So as we think about it, it might be easier to translate this combination with respect to the function and the purpose aspects, that the earth was chaotic with no purpose. That's the void part. And it was useless and unproductive. That's the void part. Okay. So notice they're very similar to each other, but yet there's nuance in the difference. Any thoughts about that? Because that's a pretty important point.
There is still a sense of physical.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because the earth has physical quality.
Right. And the wilderness would and all those things. There is a physical aspect, but that's not the focus of the author in these cases. Yeah. Yep.
It still comes back to there is still a physical aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And we're going to use that as a framework to build around. Yes. So this is not to say that there is no physical context. This is just to say that the important message is not that. That's not what Moses is trying to convey, or why he's wanting to talk about these things. All right. So that then sets the stage. So the earth was without form and void. And then we go into days 1 through 6. And like we talked about last week, remember there's a correlation. Days 1 and 4, days 2 and 5, and days 3 and 6 go together. And what we're going to see him do, if this is the problem, that the earth is without form and void, then what we're going to do is solve the formlessness first, and then we're going to solve the void, the worthlessness, the unproductiveness second. Okay. So, and there's going to be a little bit of overlap, but days 1 through 3 is going to address the first problem. Days 4 through 6 is going to address the second problem. And that's that structure that we were getting into last week with that parallelism within the chiastic formula. Those guys are going to go back to this statement of the earth is without form and void. All right. And of course, this will be important later as we start to dig into some of the more important messages underlying what's actually written down. All right. Now, what's interesting, I don't know if you guys have ever noticed it, but in all 3 of these first 3 days, the creative events all have something in common. And that something in common is that God actually separates. That's his activity. He's going to separate one thing from another thing, or one thing out of another thing. And in that separation, he's going to create something new. Okay. And in the context of where we're going, what we're going to do is bring order to what's going on, build this framework in a physical sense, like Jim's talking about, but we're going to do so for a functional purpose. Okay. So in verse 4 there, what do we see? And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Okay. So on day 1, we created the light. And the light was created in that through this process of separating it from the darkness. On day 2, all right, let's go back to that. On day 2, we see in verse 6, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters above from the waters below. So what we're doing is we're creating a space inside this water above and waters below. That'll make sense, or that makes sense in the context of the world that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. One thing I would point out here on days 1 and 2 is, and God separated the light from the darkness, and he separated the waters from the waters into the waters above and the waters below, with the expanse in the midst of them. We'll come back to this a little bit later if we have time, but you remember what the end of verse 2 was about? The earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep, so it was already pre-existent in verse 2. And the Spirit of God was doing what? Hovering over the face of the deep, or the waters. So the waters were there, the darkness was there, and what he did was he separated the light out of that darkness, and now he separated that water to create the expanse. And then on day 3, we don't see the Hebrew word for separate here, but we do see a similar word in the sense of let the waters under the heavens be gathered. So in this case, he's pulling them together into one place, and in that process, the dry land appears. So it is, in a sense, a separation of the waters in such a way that dry land was able to appear, and it was so. Okay. And of course, the other result, or the other activity during day 3, was in verse 11. Not so much a separation. The separation was the creation of dry land, but then once we had dry land, let the earth sprout vegetation, and it did. Okay. So after these first 3 days, we have 3 constructs. All right. We've got light and darkness. We've got an expanse with waters above and below. And we've got dry land with plants all over. Okay. So this is God's solution to the earth was without form. This earth was chaotic and had no order. He has now put orders in place with light and dark, the expanse with waters above and below, and the dry land, plants all over it, sea around that. Okay. All right. Now in days 4 through 6, what he's going to do is install functionaries within those constructs. So day 4, and we're going to come back to each one of these and take a look at it in a little bit more detail. But in day 4, we've got verse 14. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. So we see that separation of day and night again. But here he's going to install lights to take part in that. Okay. And he made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. In verse 20, we get God says, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth and across the expanse of the heavens. Okay, so remember, first separation was light and dark, and now we put the greater lights in place. Day 2 was create the expanse, waters above and below. Now we've got fish in the waters, birds in the air. And then on day 6, and remember, day 3 was dry land appears, plants all over it, waters around the dry land. And in day 6, we get the creation of living creatures, livestock, wild beasts, creeping things, everything according to its kind. And then eventually we get what? Man. Okay. So what we see is that in day 1, we separated the light from darkness. Day 2, we made the expanse and separated the waters. Day 3, we made the dry land. On day 4, we put lights into the dark, or into the light and dark. In day 5, we filled the waters and the expanse with birds and fish. And in day 6, we filled the dry land with creatures and man. And so these now constitute three major stories within the story that God has taken credit for. Okay. That God has constructed, and these are the 3 that he's chosen to tell the Israelites at the base of Sinai that this is how I created the earth. Okay. Now remember as well that the context of the 6 days is more related to them learning about the Sabbath than this actually being a kind of one of our regular weeks that God's doing all this in. But within the context of teaching them about the Sabbath, he's trying to teach them about the way in which they should go about their work. Okay. All right. And so if we think about these in the functional sense, the functions are really quite interesting and tell us quite a bit about what God's trying to communicate. One of the, I think, most interesting things about this passage, and technically should have maybe struck you as, whoa, that's a little weird, is in verse 5. So in verse 4, it says, and God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from darkness, and God called the light day. Why didn't he call light light? I mean, what's a day? It's a measurement of time. It's a concept. It's not a thing. Not in a kind of a physical sense. Obviously there's physical timekeeping that goes with it, and we use it to identify things around us. But when he says that he called the light day and the darkness he calls night, day and night, and then that kind of becomes part of that refrain. There was evening, there was morning through that nighttime period, and then the day starts. This tells us a little bit more about what God's getting at here. The light is not light because of photons and wavelengths and frequencies and things like that. What we've created is day. Okay. So when you look at the definition, a period of 24 hours as a unit of time reckoned from one midnight to the next, corresponding to the rotation of the earth on its axis. That's from Webster's.com. All right. Did Moses know anything about the rotation of the earth on its axis? No, so that can't be part of that definition. One midnight to the next. Well, they did think about it that way, but they did not have 24-hour clocks like we did. So we can leave the midnight out of it. Were their days necessarily 24 solar hours? No. So the definition, once we've kind of crossed out all of our modern day concepts out of that definition, would be what? Just what Lee said. Day is a period of a unit of time. Okay. And in the context of the ancient person, what is that unit of time? That's the period where I go to work. Okay. And during those, light hours of the day and warm hours of the day. Okay. So on days 1 and 4, God created time, and we actually see that borne out in day 4 as well, because you remember when we were reading through, start in verse 14, God says, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and years. Does that have anything to do with physical nature of light and stuff? No. This doesn't even have anything to do with darkness. This is specifically what we're talking about is God creating time. Okay. And it was so God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. And he also made the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Okay. So what he's seeing is good there is the activity of basically the form was made, order was brought, the separation of light and darkness. And now we've got these lights, the greater light and the lesser light, to rule in those contexts, to give, basically impose fill the emptiness, that void, make it productive. Okay, so we've gotten rid of the chaos and now we've made it productive and useful. It's no longer worthless. And those together in the context of time, it was good. Okay, it now accomplishes what God created it for. And in the lives of those folks, that was the important piece. Okay. Functional 2, let's see if we can get through 2 and 3, and then we might take a break tonight. 14, nope, hold on. And 6, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, let's separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above, and it was so. Verse 8, and God called the expanse heaven. There was evening and there was morning the second day. Okay, this is one we actually have to be a little careful on. And we've mentioned this a couple of times. But I think this one out of the 3, our mind does really want to go to material things. Okay, because we automatically go to sky and atmosphere. I mean, these are all concepts that would be very foreign to Moses and these people. It's not appropriate for us to conceptualize expanse in those terms. Okay. Now, like I said last week, though, it's also not fair for us to think or attribute to Moses and the ancients that this is some like wall of water or whatever. Okay. Now, it was more substantial to them, but whatever it was, they couldn't see it. They just knew that up there was water came from up there, came down to the earth, and they needed to explain that somehow. And so if we function on the physical aspects, a lot of this doesn't make sense, but if we function or look at the functions, then we see a different message. Okay, so on days 2, the important thing there is he's creating a space. Okay, he's creating this expanse, this space in which, because remember, what's going to happen is we've got waters above, waters below. And then in day 3, he's going to separate the waters below and so that land appears. Okay. Now, if we're walking around on land, where are we? Where are we? We're in the expanse. Okay. So the days 2 and 5 are about God setting up this habitat really for us to live in. Basically, he's given us a place to live. So days 1 and 4, he's created time. Days 2 and 5, he's creating space to live. And we also see that he's going to provide for us in that way. Okay. And the other thing we've got to understand is that waters above and waters below take on a very different context for the ancient folks. So if you look at, let's see, I may have them in here. Yeah, Genesis 7:11 and 8. So this is dealing with Noah. So in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep and the windows of the heavens were open. I mean, it poured. And After the 40 days and 40 nights, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were closed, and the rains from the heavens were restrained. Okay. Here's one in Leviticus. So remember, Leviticus is about the sacrificial system and obedience and being holy. Basically, he's defining what holy means for them, which we will get into a bit. If you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rains in their season, and the hand shall yield its increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. The implication, of course, it's not an implication because he explicitly states it later. If you do not do these things, what happens? I will close them off, right? The rain is going to go away. Now we see that multiple times throughout the history of the Israelites. Deuteronomy, Lord will open to you his good treasury, the heavens, and give the rain to your land in its season to bless all the work of your hands. Again, it's conditional. You have got to obey. You've got to be holy. If you decide to do other things, blessings turn into curses. And here's in Chronicles. I think this is around Ahab's time. I have to look it up. But when I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or I command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people who are called by my name would humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. Okay. So what role does especially the waters above play in all of this? It is God's provision for us. Okay. God's rain, which God will either give or withhold based on whether we're doing what we're supposed to be doing as his people. These waters served a very substantial purpose. Okay. In Noah's day, how did the people feel about getting too much? They weren't too happy about it. In Ahab's day, how did they feel about not getting any? Weren't very happy about it. Okay. There's a sweet spot with water. All right. Too much, we get overwhelmed. Too little, we wither and die. And God makes it very clear that I am creating this expanse for you to live in. The waters above are mine to control. And this is the area that I have created and where I will then take care of you in that context. This, of course, will play into the third functional group. So in day 3, what do we see? We saw the waters gathered, especially the waters below gathered, and the dry land appears. The dry land he calls earth. The waters that were gathered called the seas. He sees that it's good. Then let earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees and so on. Okay. So certainly this is going to link back to the rain and the provision of rain. Most important event, of course, here is the that emergence of the dry land. One thing that kind of bothers some folks about this is in this day 3, there's really no creative act. God doesn't make anything. Okay, and that bothers some commentators if you read enough of them. But what's interesting is that what they're bothered by only makes sense if we're talking about physical things. If we're talking about functional things, this day fits in seamlessly with day 1 and day 2. Okay, and the functional connection in this one, and this is how we know to kind of go back to days 1 and 4 and 2 and 5 and look for them. What is the purpose of the land and the plants? God actually tells us over in verse 29. It's what? He created those on day 6, and the plants from day 3 were what? Food. It just says it. They were food. Okay. And so the God establishes this basis of food. We also see in this day 6, and can tie it into day 3 as well, with the aspects of be fruitful and multiply, this idea of fertility and fecundity. The one generation gives rise to the next, gives rise to the next. These are seen as blessings from God, right? Blessed is the man who has a lot of kids, right? Whose quiver is full. We see, we will come back to this when we dig into the creation of humans, but what exactly does subdue and have dominion mean? It must have some context within that passage, okay? And so within this, we see these gifts that God's created of, he's given us food for us and the animals, and he also has created a way in which we can fulfill his blessing, right? Why are we being fruitful and multiply? God's purpose was to fill the land, okay, fill the earth. And so just as the fish would fill the sea, birds would fill the air, the livestock and wild animals would fill the land. Okay, so we see these functional elements here. And trying to see where. All right, so we've got day 1 where we separated light from the darkness, and what the functional aspect that we've created is time. On day 2, we made the expanse by separating the waters above and below. Functional context is a place to live, and he takes care of us by providing the rain. And then on days 3 and 6, he gathered the waters and dry land appeared and sprouted vegetation. And so among other things, there are some other more minor food, fertility, and domestication all show up in those. These are all functional aspects of God's creation. These are gifts that were given to animals and man. We're told to do all of this within that context. And like I said, we will come back to what it means for humans to be made in God's image. And as we're made in God's image, we then would subdue and have dominion over the rest of creation. How does that play into this context? So these 3 concepts of time, a place to live, and food. I mean, think about how the ancients would have thought about that. I mean, think about us when Hurricane Matthew went through and we were without power for 10 days. I mean, we were kind of done with the rain at that point, but food was of interest, right? Where are we going to get it? And so these were things that the ancient cultures found very important about the world around them. And this is what they focused on. This is what the Israelites were focused on. Why did they want to go back to Egypt? We're dying out here, and all you're giving us is this manna to eat, and I want some fish with spices.
That's where they came up with the
Right. So there was a lot of complaining, and it had to do with how I was living and what food I had to eat and how long we were out. Is all about this sort of time and space to live. And so God's teaching them that I am responsible for these things. Okay. These are things I have provided for you, and I am God, and you are my people, and you will be that. Okay. So never forget that aspect of it. All of this is happening at the foot of Mount Sinai to that group that just came out of Egypt. Okay. And this is who we're trying to teach these lessons to. And so there's one more piece to this, which we will pick up with next week and then move into that stuff about the man. Okay. And it's because if this is what we are conceptualizing here, is this idea of a space to live. I don't have my laser pointer, but you've got space to live. We've got time with the lights and stuff created to rule the day and the night. And in all of these ancient cultures, and I'll just show you this one because obviously this is the one we just came from. Egypt. They saw the same thing, but they saw it very differently. Actually, they didn't. They didn't see it very differently. And that was the problem. Okay. All of these things, time and food and space to live and rain and plants growing and animals having babies, my herds doing well, me having kids, all of this in their world was because the gods were happy or sad or mad or whatever. Okay. There is some kind of a deity. Okay. So we've got Nut, the sky goddess, we've got Geb, the earth god. We've got Ra with his son. Well, actually, Ra is probably over there with the sun. His boat goes from the east, sets in the west. So the sun comes up, sun comes down. The Shu probably in the middle, the sky god holding up the expanse of Nut. Every one of these aspects of the physical world for the Egyptians had a god in place that was responsible for it. And they worshiped those gods and they sacrificed to those gods in order to keep the sun coming up, in order to keep the rains coming, in order to keep all of these things going. And you think the Israelites were free of that stuff? We know very well that they won't. And that's where we'll pick up next week. Because they were very much in this world for 400 years. This is how they saw what was going on around them. They had absorbed it. And this is what God's trying to fix. Okay. So when we go back through this and look at God creating time and place to live and the rain and food and animal husbandry, basically being able to have our herds and take care of them and being able to have kids and keep our family going because the family is important. Remember the generations that Toledo we looked at last week. All of these are of critical importance to these ancient people. And God is going to systematically remove the gods from their concept. Because what does commandment number 1 say? You shall have no other God but me. Okay. So basically read it that way this week. Okay. So we'll be right back here in chapter 1 again to start out with. Well, actually we'll be into chapter 1 because we're going to dig into the image of God stuff too. But think about how the Egyptians would have seen this and what God's trying to fix about it. Okay. Why it's important for God to make it very clear that those don't exist. Those are meaningless, right? They're not there. You are worshiping things that aren't even real. These are my creations. And you will not, what does the second commandment say? Make no idols. So you will not worship any of my creations. You're not going to make wood or metal or stone versions of anything, of man, animals, and plants. I mean, he's basically getting it all, right? In order to try to clear up their way of thinking. And unfortunately, while he's, I mean, just as case in point, while Moses is up there getting those commandments, what are the Israelites doing? They made a golden calf. And I bet you that golden calf looked a whole lot like the cow from Egypt, the sun god, not Ra, but the other one. We'll talk about him because he'll show up in the plagues where God hits the land with darkness. Okay. All right. Let me pray for us. We'll say that. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this with study tonight. Thank you for what you teach us in chapter 1 here. It's just as important for us today as it is to them. We just got to remember that you are God and you are the only God and the only God. You are a God that's jealous. You will not allow us to have other gods in our lives. And while we may not build golden calves and things like that, we do still struggle with other idols in our lives. We pray that you would help us to learn what's in here. And as we pick it up next week, pray that you'd keep this on our minds and get us ready to absorb the rest of it next week. In your name we pray, amen.